we're going to invite up both Jarrod and Greg, and we're going to spend a little bit of time asking them some questions. If you want to shoot questions through while we're going through the Q&A, please feel free to do so on email. That's fantastic. But let's first up get Greg and Jarrod back up here.
You can go in the middle now.
You're in the middle, mate. Two short guys on the side.
Rows between the... No, never mind.
It's more intimate, right? All right. Well, this is a balancing act with a microphone. Oh, it's only a Samsung. I could drop that. It's fine. It's all right. First up, I think there's a whole lot of questions here, which is fantastic. But one of the ones that came up, Greg, for you early on today was you're talking a little bit about detention centres and protest movements that happen inside them. And Jarrod, you're talking about children in detention. Greg, can you give us a little bit of insight about where those two things combine, where children get caught up in what's happening inside detention and what impact that has on them?
Yeah, I suppose I should start by saying there's a lot of really appropriate demonstration action that people undertake in detention, asylum seekers undertake in detention. So I'm going to premise the story with that and say it is appropriate for people to have a voice. And the reality is, even if appropriate protest action takes place inside a detention centre, I wouldn't necessarily equate that to them having a voice. But there are lots and lots of things that asylum seekers do to try and get a message out or to just cry for help often. But there's one story I suppose is probably a good one to share. There was one situation where really for me, the idea of young people being caught up in that kind of action was really graphic. It was on Nauru actually, and the guy was 18, but he was an 18-year-old, one of those young 18-year-olds, you know the kind. And what happened was there was a demonstration. It was actually the one I mentioned before, and there were some guys who were organising that protest and were actually being coached by an Australian-based refugee advocacy firm who advocate for things like, you know, cut yourself, sew your lips, go on voluntary starvation, things that aren't actually good for refugees when they do it to themselves, but they call themselves advocates. Now, lots of advocacy firms are excellent. This one that organised this is not, as far as I'm concerned. But these guys had a ringleader, a guy who was organising all of these various different actions, and he'd organised a mass escape. So we had a whole bunch of people who were outside the fence, had a whole bunch of security guys running around the outside of the detention centre, trying to find them all. We knew where they went over the fence, and there's only so far you can go. So we had a pretty good idea. And we'd found everybody but this one young kid. And it was like, how do we, where are we going to find him? So we kept looking, we just kept searching. Everyone goes searching out all the different options. And it was just getting dark when we found him underneath a tree just outside the centre, about probably 15, 20 metres from the fence line. And when the security officer found him, he had Vegemite painted all over his face, and he gripped the security guard's hand like a child grips their parent when they're scared. It was this kind of really vulnerable kind of grip that's just like, what's going on? And after we got him back in the centre and sat him down and tried to calm him down and help him out a little bit, wiped the Vegemite off, and just started to find out what had happened, he'd been told that it was his turn. It was his turn to run the fence. It was his job, and if he didn't do it, they'd beat him up. Simple as that. Probably kill him. And so he'd been threatened by the people organising this protest action to go outside the fence. And it just reminded me that people are complex. And what the ringleaders were thinking, I think it's horrific. I don't know, their own stories were actually pretty horrific for themselves, and they'd probably arrived at that place through their own series of horrible events and trauma for sure. But it just reminded me what happens when you get enough vulnerable and broken people into a room and take away absolutely all their hope. I think that's where you get to.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that you've been putting some of those thoughts, you write the immigration blog as well, is that right?
Yeah, that's great.
You've been putting some of those thoughts around new ideas for policy, and out of your experience, what you think could be done differently. We've got a lot of questions actually coming in about exactly that, aimed at you both. From a policy standpoint, I guess the first point is if you could summarise what you would say would be an ideal policy to put forward, or an ideal state for us to be in at the moment, and then explain maybe a little bit about how you think that can come about. That's a lot to digest in once, right? Yeah. But I know it's something that you both have thought about a fair bit. Jarrod, maybe if you want to.
Yeah. One of the things I love about those of us in the room that are Presbyterian, and given it's Kirk Place, there are a few, is the way that you organise and that you get a say together. And what I was talking about in terms of the alternative politics of the kingdom, I really did mean. I think once we start as a community being faithful, it's the first step in actually repentance, that we're removing the log from our own eye, where we actually read Scripture from a different position. Instead of, thank you God, I'm not like those that are advocating for this good policy. I'm one of those that we know how problematic, and that these people that are in detention are just like the rest of us. Like, are just as wonderful and annoying and frustrating and intriguing and like ironic as the rest of us. And if we actually start to practice Christian hospitality ourselves, well, I'm fascinated by like 1 Peter 3 when it says, and when I became a Christian, it was one of my first memory verses, be ready to give an answer for the hope you have. Those of Christian circles that ever had that tough crowd? Okay, just me. It's because in the context of the passage, they see something in our life that looks like something. And so then when we go to engage our local member, or we go to engage the immigration minister, it comes out of this place of contrition and repentance, this sense of like, as a broken brother, talking to a broken brother. But to get to the pointy end of the question, I really think that Christian hospitality is a real alternative. My prayer is for an end to detention, both offshore, but quick processing that can happen in the community. That what we need is a quick turnover, and if people aren't appropriate, it's fine. We do what we have to do. But if they are, regardless, after doing years of prison ministry, visiting and running Alternatives to Violence project in prisons, at least these guys, and I was working in protection block with people who have killed and done unspeakable things, but they know it's a life sentence, or they know when they're up for parole. These people, and their only crime is fleeing war-torn situations, they don't know when this gig is up. So speedy, communal processing, I think, is the only humane way forward.
Yeah, and that speaks a little bit to, Greg, what you were saying earlier today about about detention centres bringing together people who have suffered trauma and who have post-traumatic stress disorder, let alone other psychological issues, being crammed into a place with no hope and no possibility of a way out, being a breeding pot for that kind of unrest. We know that. We know a little bit about Manus. We know that it costs $1 billion to run, and that one person's been processed only since it's been opened. You've worked in that immigration space. Do you see some hope in the Department of Immigration? Do you see some hope in the people working there to bring light to that situation?
Very good question. Look, I'd say I'm not at all a fan of the idea of just saying all people who work for immigration are bad. Government bad, refugees good, is as simplistic as stop the boats. It's dumb. I mean, it's ridiculous. There are some excellent, wonderful, intelligent, people full of integrity working for the Department of Immigration, and some of them are in a position of authority, some of them are in a position of influence, and some of those people advise government well. And they advise government courageously, and it's really, really important that those people stay. I had to grapple with whether I was one of them, and if I was leaving, would that remove them? Thankfully, it wasn't a big deal. But the point is that there are some excellent people advising very well, and governments have to choose whether to listen to or not. I don't know that their advice is always good, because you have to also sometimes help politicians work out how they're going to navigate the politics, not just the policy. We might not be doing that too well, but at the end of the day, I think there is hope in that sense. And I think we need to do it incrementally. Inside the department, officers have to do it incrementally. They have to teach politicians that it's okay to change parts of the policy and work towards something and listen to the right advice across the board, and start with some of the smaller things perhaps and slowly get some runs on the board as we see it's a big ship to turn around now. We've gone a long way down a long path.
Absolutely. And let's follow that train of thought for a little while. We're talking then about how, I guess we've painted this idea of what community processing could be, and we've talked a little bit about how we turn that ship around. It'd be great, maybe, Jarrod, if you could share a little bit from your experience about what it would take to turn that ship around? What can one person or one church or one community do? I know we've kind of steered away from talking politically, but in terms of advocacy, in terms of prayer, how can we bring about that change?
Sure, and one of the things about Welcome to My Place is that it actually is about a meal. You can go have a picnic with people, and suddenly you're not praying for an abstract, you're praying for your friend Ahmed, you're praying for your friend Raul, like there's a real person there. Out of that, when you then go to meet Reb Zalman, I love you, bro. Excuse me 1 second, I know this isn't really appropriate. Back to the question. From there, when meeting with your local politician, first off, like, have a commitment to truth, not propaganda. Go with what's true. Research, find out. Don't go with either the right or the left's quick grabs and those people are the problem, either politicians or refugees or whatever. Be informed, and then when you meet with your local politician, you can start to talk about the wonderful work with Simple Love and the work you're doing. Humanise the people. These are people you're praying for. Ask the politician if they'd feel comfortable you praying for them. See if you can actually invite them to one of these kind of picnics. Don't go in aggressive. Don't go in defensive. Don't go on, to quote John Dixon, thinking that Australia is a backslidden Christian. Go in with a kind of humility of seeking the peace of the land and tell your story out of your real desire to follow Jesus and practice Christian hospitality. And that has incredible cut through. That humility has incredible cut through. And it changes people. So that's what I would advise.
So John Dixon didn't say we should treat people like backslidden Christians. He was saying the same thing, don't treat people like that. It just sounded like you were saying John Dixon was all for treating people like that.
So John Dixon is saying, do not treat the nation state like it was a backslidden Christian. Like, actually have the humility like the early church that we're not in power, we're just a part of the mix like everybody else, and be faithful, that kind of gear.
I like that point. I love that idea.
Yeah, excellent. And for people out there, I know a lot of people in this church and in churches like it have participated in things like letter writing and petition signing, as well as the Light the Dark night that was held for Reza Barati. Have you seen those things as ways of turning the conversation? And do you get hope from them in terms of what you see forward for Australia's policy?
You're probably better qualified to speak on that. I can certainly say that in the last little while, I think we've begun to see a real shift because of behaviours and actions like that. I think we are at a point where people are starting to realise that it's a new government and they don't have to like them because they just voted for them. They can actually start to criticise them in a helpful way, because the political discussion is mellowing from the election. We're far enough out now for people's ideas to start to develop and change. And I think there's a group of people who are beginning to think about this issue more than they did before the last election. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, great.
I don't want to be overly naive. Things are actually pretty dark. Thank you, good night. No, this isn't merely about human rights. This is actually about the most ancient human wrong, where, like the situation with Cain and Abel, we find somebody else to blame. And that works really well for us. It's their fault. And one of the things that we must do in our actions, to quote Martin Luther King, we have to find even provocative ways, but Christ-like ways, humble ways, non-violent ways that speak of the cross, to actually lance the boil of scapegoating that is going on in our society, to humanise all that are involved, to realise that our struggles are not against flesh and blood, that our struggles are actually against principalities and powers and these structures that are bent on dehumanisation of these very vulnerable people. At the moment, our current situation is held together by the scapegoating of these vulnerable people. And when you humanise asylum seekers and refugees, you're doing prophetic work. You're doing work that speaks of God's coming kingdom. But you also need to realise the blessing of being persecuted, and you'll be given a hard time, like Dr. King complained, called a rebel rouser, an agitator, from his letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963. But it was those images of Bull Connor turning the hoses on children in Birmingham that made people realise how bad the segregation that we all thought was just normal because it's the water we swim in actually is. So what I would encourage you to do, because some of my frustration is I've been doing this stuff for, like, my first action at Baxter was 2005. First time we invited somebody into our house to live was 2004. I've got really good at praying the lament psalms, not just like the psalms that we sing in songs on Sunday mornings often. And that's all part of the journey, is realising that God can take our pain and our frustration and our despair and turn it into something beautiful. In the same way as the mushrooms, in the same way as the coins, in the same way as meth labs, and the same way as us as well. But we have to be in this for the long haul. This is work about being faithful.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just got one more question for you both, and they both relate to your kind of specific stories, and both kind of have come through a lot in the questions that we've asked. So I'll go to you, Greg, first, and then to you, Jarrod, to close off. So that specific example questions from your time. Greg, you talked a bit about being on Christmas Island at the time of that boat crash that we heard so much about. You talked about being a Christian, trying to reconcile your gospel view in with the life that you were living at work. That moment must clearly have been a big moment for you in your life. Looking back on that, how do you see that moment? How do you reflect on that time? And what lessons have you learnt from that for us here, as we hear stories of Manus and we hear stories of Nauru?
I think everybody has the boat crash etched into their memory, just from the TV images. That period of 4 days following that, what happened was the incident was managed by the Emergency Management Committee, of which I was a member. And the 4 days was a big 4 days. So my staff and I had been involved in looking for bodies that might float up to the surface in the days that followed, that might have been caught under some rocks. When the swell went down, they might then float, and you got to catch those bodies and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of really horrible jobs where you're standing there looking out to the ocean, just hoping it doesn't happen on your shift, kind of thing. We knew that about 50 people had died, or we suspected it was a bit over 50, including quite a few children. Many of the bodies of those children had been recovered. And there were some amazing stories of people involved in that recovery effort. And it just drove home the danger of these voyages, the danger that people subject themselves to. And I think that highlights the just how horrific the places they're running from are. Just amazing. Horrible. And so what I did is, at the end of the 4 days, I basically hadn't slept for 4 days because of the involvement in this response. And this is kind of selfish maybe, at the end of it, I went and just kind of tried to get my head out of it, just go and take some time out, a couple of hours. The way I used to do that on Christmas Island was to go snorkeling. Flying Fish Cove, which you see, is absolutely amazing diving and coral. It is absolutely spectacular. And it was still a little bit rough. The swell was still around, but I'm like, I'm going snorkeling. I'm just going to go out. And when I'm snorkeling, I don't know if you do much snorkeling, but you feel like you're flying in another world, and it is unbelievable. I love it. I could snorkel all day and all night if I had the choice. And I was snorkeling. Normally what I'd do, I'll be totally honest, I'd go for a snorkel and then I'd swim back to the beach, where I'd usually have left a 6-pack of Coronas. And I'd sit on the beach and watch the sunset and have a beer. And and then I'd go back to work. Not after the Corona. I only had one of the Coronas. I didn't drink the whole 6-pack. But this day I was like, I just need that relaxed time. I just need to take some time out and process what I've just gone through and what everybody else has just gone through, and the stories of these families who've lost their kids and all of these things. And I'm snorkeling around and I'm doing the whole dive down and look at fish and all that sort of stuff. And I come across this bit of coral which has just a young girl's headscarf caught underneath it. And you just know immediately on seeing it. I don't know if you can cry underwater, but I suppose I did. You just know that this is the headscarf of a young girl who's died. And so everything just comes flooding back all of a sudden. And you go, this is, whatever's going on here has got some real life costs. And that includes they're just kids. They're just kids. They're not perfect, but they're just kids. They're wonderful children with so much opportunity. They made it almost to Australia. You just don't know what would have happened in their life if they'd survived. And anyway, that was for me a really defining moment in that boat crash experience, where I'm like, wow. this is real. This is real.
Yeah, that must have been an incredibly difficult time to be on Christmas Island, and thinking particularly of those children who didn't make it. We're lucky in Jarrod to have an example of the lives of some refugees who have and who have found the safety and security of the First Home project. We've got a whole stream of questions that have come in related to that. How can we get involved, and how can we help in that? And what is happening next for you?
Sure. So the family I talked about, our first family that moved in on Christmas Eve, and we joked that there was room in the inn. Get it? Christian jokes, huh? Huh? You're welcome. After 1 year with us, they had a rental history as well as close friends, and both parents had stable work. The kids were starting to do well in school instead of the problematic behaviour that was there before. They've now got their own rental property. Both parents have got work, and they've actually qualified for Key Start, which in WA means that in an area that the West Australian government is looking to develop, they can build a home and then slowly pay it back. So it's one of these incredible, like, as I was saying before, it's not really rocket science. In terms of the future of First Home Project, we bought this block, and I had a whole heap of slides and stories that we never even got to. But in terms of when Steve and Naomi, when you come and visit us and stay with us, next month, what you'll see is we've got this vacant block next to us, which has been rezoned, so we can build up to 18 dwellings across the two. So we've got no idea where we're going to get the money from, but we didn't know where we were going to get it from the first time after the bank said, no way. Oh, yeah, by the way, we got the money in 14 days, and it's a phenomenal story, and it literally came down to the last minute. But maybe we can hang out another time and we can tell the rest of the story. So we intend to do, because the families are with us for a year, to get on their feet and to then get out in the community and make the incredible contributions that all the families that we have with us can. We'd love to see young Christians live with the families in the same kind of try-in pattern of there's us as hosts and then 2 other families, and so to replicate that 3 or 4 times on the... Teresa's a trained social work. Both of us have worked in community development. It is really important you do it in ways that are completely integrous. But if I may, or may not, did you have one more question you wanted to ask? Because what I really want people to take away is how we frame the debate.
Yeah, I'd love you to speak for that.
I'm glad you asked, Tim. I think this is the most important takeaway, because as soon as you start talking about it, people will say, yeah, but boats are dangerous. And the right response to that is, yeah, they are. It's horrific. It's horrific. People get on boats for the same reason people jump from burning buildings. It's that if you stay, you'll die. And the way I frame the debate is that there is a building with a street front, and the street front has 100 windows. Yes, there is one fire truck there, and yes, it is responding. It has one ladder to one window, and that's the UNHCR. And so when people go, you need to come through the proper channels, well, that's great if you buy that window. But the other 99% of asylum seekers risk burning to death unless they jump and do something desperate. When we zoom in and we focus on people smugglers, that's people standing on the outside of the ledge of a window with a brick, breaking it and saying, give me some money and I'll let you jump. But the real question is, how do we, not alone, but actually become a regional leader of responding to these fires, some of which we lit? I mean, when we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, we should probably, if we're going to bomb their countries, we should probably take the victims in when they run away from that bombing. That probably wasn't said as gracious as I could have. The focus actually needs to be upon how do we have a regional response and become a regional leader to putting out fires and put up more ladders and respond to people so they can safely leave these burning buildings. When you go into talking about this with friends or family members or people in the workplace or other people at church, or maybe in your Bible study during the week, you'll get these questions. Ask them to zoom out, get them to see the burning building, and then start talking about how can we respond. We have to have a way of framing it that allows for all the complexities. Otherwise, the spin of politicians on all sides is what we buy because life's, it's complicated and there's a lot going on and we have to move on. So if I can encourage you, one window, that's the 1%, that's the UNHCR. And the question is, how do we put out the flames and how do we respond to those who are otherwise going to jump?
Thanks, Jarrod. I think that was a super helpful way to close off this Q&A time. I want to encourage you guys as we finish up tonight to grab one of these two. Greg's got a long drive ahead of him, so make sure you entertain him as you hold him hostage here for a little while, ask him questions. Oh, he's not going home tonight. He can be here for ages. But I want to encourage you guys as we finish up to grab these guys and to ask them any other questions that might be on your mind as well. The questions that you've shot through here to the Q&A email as well, I'll pass on to the elders here, and hopefully we'll be able to tackle them in church as well if we haven't got to them tonight. But I think what we should do now is thank these guys for giving of their time and coming and speaking tonight. So